Welcome everybody to our meeting, and tonight we're going to be looking at the motor symptoms. So the windmill camping area of the map of Parkinson's is representing the motor symptoms of the condition. And Parkinson's is something that's a very visible condition on the motor level. And they used to call it the triad of motor symptoms, which were the first three on the list here. So stiffness, the slowness of movement, the bradykinesia, and the classic tremor. Although actually, probably most of you will realise that tremor is only a feature in about 7 out of 10 cases of Parkinson's disease. So there are those kind of non-tremor forms, or the reverse as well, the tremor dominant type. So those used to be called the triad of motor symptoms, and then it became the cardinal 4 symptoms when postural instability got added to the list. And that's the kind of the list of motor symptoms that kind of followed in medical assessments. Those are often the symptoms that will be measured in research, looking at efficacy of interventions such as medications or surgical treatments. And tonight in this talk, we're going to have a look at these things in a bit more detail, and thinking of them more in terms, rather than sort of like in the pure medical terms, but thinking in terms of people's day-to-day lives and how these symptoms manifest for the lives of people with Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease was first described, as you will know, by Dr. James Parkinson just over 200 years ago. He published his essay on shaking palsy, as he called it, at that time, but the disease got renamed quite soon after by Charcot, who called it Parkinson's disease. And actually, if you travel around the world and see people in Australia, they look exactly the same as the patients in your own clinics. This typical stooped posture, the mask-like face in this drawing from Parkinson's original essay. It's very recognizable in our clinics, and also recognizable around large crowds in things like airport waiting areas. If you're observing large crowds, you'll see people perhaps carrying one arm as they walk, a lack of arm swing on one side. And if you ever travel with, sorry, the cat wants to get on the keyboard. If you ever travel with Parkinson's specialists, you'll find yourself spotting people who are going to go on and develop Parkinson's disease in future from this carrying of the arm, this abnormal lack of arm swing on one side. So it's a very physical condition, very physically obvious. And James Parkinson actually wrote his essay based on just 6 people that he followed around London streets mainly. One of them he examined, but the other 5 he just observed as having this same constellation of observable features. So the modern management of the mobility problems that are caused by these physical symptoms tend to be a sort of a mixed management style that's offered to people. So partly through the use of medication, symptoms progress, and there can be some sort of interim benefits, but then longer term side effects, and we'll come into those a bit later tonight. And then there's a lot of work over the last 20 years or so. We've seen a lot of research and clinical use of a wide range of cognitive and sensory coping strategies becoming adopted and more widely used in the physiotherapy profession, speech and language therapy, sometimes called Lee Silverman voice technique, or attention to effort voice training, as I think NICE called that. So educational approaches are both about the condition, getting rid of illness, misbeliefs about mobility. It's not unusual perhaps for patients to anticipate becoming severely immobile within maybe quite a few number of years. And they may well have seen Parkinson's in generations older than where that did happen before medication was available. People did become eventually sort of more and more physically inert without medication. So there's a lot around education and mobility promotion and coping strategies. And then in more recent years, particularly I think the last 10 years, there's been a lot more talk around the benefits of physical activity and exercise of various types. And we'll think a bit more about that as we go on through our evening talk. So looking now at an example of Parkinson's gait. This typical shuffling, so frustrating.
Oh, I'm fighting the boy. I'm right here.
When the feet freeze, the upper body seems quite still fluid in its movement, so the hands could actually be used to cause a fall, or someone to grab for that person while their feet were frozen. It's this very difficult maneuver of just changing direction, turning around.
Yes.
So again, the shuffling, episodes of freezing of gait, and yet quite easy to move the hands and arms, whilst the feet are sort of glued to the ground. As the target of the chair's approach, notice how the shuffling gait sort of seems to get even more difficult and problematic. The movements become even more restricted. So now we're going to see a short therapy intervention to address this.
Magus, what I'm going to do now is to show you some ways of making the steps larger so that you can walk more easily. What I want you to do is really think about large steps. I want you to concentrate on your feet taking large steps. To help you get started, I'm going to put a few markers down. All right, off we go again.
Doesn't really matter whether you walk on or between the lines, it's just getting that wider stride.
Picture those big long steps in your mind.
Now without the cues, so the cues we use for training, and now that process has been internalized. So this is self-cueing, having been trained with visual cues. Lovely smile to finish.
How was that? Pretty good. That was pretty good.
So that was an example from, as you can see in the caption on the screen, from a clinic in Melbourne that I visited back in 1998 when this film was made. I actually managed to visit the team and observe the work that they were doing, and they were teaching and produce this video that I managed to share with you tonight through the wonders of technology. And then we'll look at, again at some other movement issues. So swapping back, so the people who weren't here on the first session won't have seen this, but others may have seen it before. So this is looking at another mobility problem in Parkinson's, bed transfers. And this particular individual was putting a lot of time and effort into getting himself into bed and into a comfortable position. And he was up frequently at night. He's got a tremor dominant type of Parkinson's. His Parkinson's is very tremor dominant. So he, as you can see, while he's moving, he's still got that tremor there. And he was struggling quite a lot in terms of getting himself comfortable, spending quite a lot of time over the maneuver. So again, cueing strategy. So he's going to now just demonstrate a technique that he learns in a therapy session with a set of kind of demonstration first and then verbal cueing. So I'll talk him through the movements as the film runs. And what we'll see is bend knees, turn head, drop knees, reach over, and roll. Legs over edge, and push to sit up. So again, that's a coping strategy, and that's sort of demonstrating again the kind of verbal cues that this gentleman has then internalized so that he could run that movement on kind of a manual control to deal with the movement problem with his bed transfer. And then we'll watch another bed mobility problem. So this problem is really rooted in the rigidity symptom of Parkinson's. So rigidity in the trunk, axial rigidity, as the physiotherapists will call this, is preventing this lady from just rolling onto her side and getting out of the bed. So the rigidity of the trunk is just limiting the power of that turn, and she's just not quite able to get herself into the position to move on through the movement sequence. As you can see, she's grasping for help from anything she can find, and she'd actually spent the previous 2 years sleeping on the sofa because of this and rolling onto the floor, and then crawling out into the hallway on the ground floor and using banister rails to get into a standing position because of this problem had been so severe. So she's not able to get out of the bed, but she's demonstrating this for you for your educational purposes. And you can see she's getting very physically fatigued now from this effort. This is about 1 minute and 45 seconds that this film lasts. But people talk about being stuck like this perhaps for half an hour, attempting to get out of bed each time they need to do so. So you can see now on the bed a simple device called a bed stick that you're probably quite familiar with. And here it is being used together with quite an old-fashioned now satin draw sheet. This was actually filmed before you could get the sheets with the low slip, the high different, what do you call it? The low friction centers. You can get them all in one now, but this was in a draw sheet style. And you can see there just a simple movement technique combined again now with these simple devices, a solution to mobility problems that could actually lead to people ending up being admitted to long-term care settings if they're unable to cope with this sort of thing at night. Because even with a partner caregiver in the house, it can be very exhausting to assist people through the night. So difficulties with nighttime mobility can be the last straw in terms of people being able to live independently. So thinking about how medication works and supports mobility, on the list of ways of optimizing mobility, I mentioned medication. And it's quite important for our patients to understand and for us to understand how their medication works in terms of supporting mobility. So in the morning, when the first dose of medication is taken, you can see the sort of dotted line on this kind of wavy line across the chart there on the screen. And the dotted line represents the kind of dopamine levels in the system of the patient first thing in the morning before they've taken a dose of medication will probably be quite low. And below that lower line, which is the line at which the level at which the medication starts to take effect and ease mobility, perhaps dampen down tremor, reduce the rigidity and reduce the slowness to a certain extent. So when people switch on, as we call it, they reach into this zone where the dopamine levels are following a sort of a comfortable pattern, not too high, not going over that upper line, not too low, not going below the lower line. Medication regimes are personalized by Parkinson's consultants so that the second, third, fourth, and whatever other doses of the day come in at intervals before the dopamine levels drop below that lower line, which is representing the point at which there's too little dopamine in the system to have those effects into supporting movement and mobility. So people need to understand why their medication is prescribed at the intervals it's given at, and then they need to take it at those intervals to get the best use of it. But if a dose of medication is taken and perhaps it's a bit stronger or is taken a bit too soon, sometimes you can sort of tip people's dopamine levels over the line, and you'll see after the third dose of the day that levels climbed quite high there. And that could be a time of the day where people are having more problems with things like their mental health, the kind of symptoms we were talking about last week, getting a bit, having hallucinations, delusions, more florid ideas. So that idea shown in after the third dose is just showing that you don't want the medication levels to be too high. There's a kind of Goldilocks zone that people want to achieve where the medication is maintained. And we'll be coming back to this chart shortly and looking in more detail at some of the problems that can occur in the long term when people with Parkinson's use medication. So longer term motor fluctuations become quite an issue. So the actual time it takes for a dose of medication to begin to have an effect, shown in that sort of sweeping up of the curve, the point at which it hits the lower line, is the point at which a patient would start to feel more animated, more able to interact with the world, to think more fluidly, to move more fluidly. So for individuals, that amount of time between the actual taking of the medication, usually in the form of a tablet, will vary over the course of their own life with the condition, but also in relation to other factors like recent meals, for instance. So an individual will generally know themselves how long it takes for a dose to take effect. And they can start to learn to be aware of that. And it might be, for one individual, it might be 10 minutes. Other people, it might be up to an hour for the dose to actually kick in. But it's good for people to start to understand how their medication is affecting them and to be aware of the regime and taking it correctly. They can start to get those kind of physical sensations that can be their prompts that, I can start to feel my medication's wearing off. Either my mood is dropping or my tremors are coming back, or I'm starting to feel slower again. And those can be reminders for people to take their medication on time and keep that balance so that the medication is steady. But you've got the little picture down in the corner there of the roast dinner and the warning above it, expect delays. And that's a reminder really about thinking about the influence of medication in the gut and the effect of like large protein meals. It's well known that if someone eats a high protein meal and takes their Parkinson's medication at the same time, that the Parkinson's medication may not have any effect or may have a much weaker effect than usual. And sort of we often explain this to patients saying that the protein competes for uptake in the stomach and the medication is missed. So if that's the case, then patients can be educated around things like the timing of the medication in relation to those meals. So taking the medication maybe half an hour before the meal. And you can pick up on this if it's, the motor fluctuation conversation with patients about you finding your medication is effective at the times when your medication doesn't seem to be helping, at the times when your movement is much more difficult during day-to-day life. And sometimes you'll pick up on this effect of the high protein roast dinner when people say that every Sunday afternoon they find it terribly difficult to move and they've had to stop going out to have pub lunches back in the day when we could do those things. Because they felt so immobile after a meal. So there are many things that can influence the impact of the drug. It's not just a matter of taking it. People get this on and off effect. So when the medication takes effect, their movement is fluid, then it wears off, then they can't move so easily. That can happen like a light switch, or some people, they sort of wind down, gradually turn off. And then some people talk about micro off, so that they're switched on, but within being switched on, they then have these kind of moments where they feel switched off. And freezing of gait during on time is not unknown. So that's an example of that. Or a hesitancy in starting to speak, or in starting to swallow, or to reach for an object. So although I've never seen much in the literature about it, patients talk about these micro on-offs. And then there's this no-on situation. So up in the top of the screen, I've got this phrase no on, where the people take a dose and it does nothing at all. So say they've had this large protein meal and they get no effect from that dose at all. And that can be quite disturbing. And if people don't understand, they haven't been educated about these things, it may lead to them actually sort of losing confidence in the medication and sort of believing, well, I took a dose, it didn't have any effect, therefore no point in taking more because it doesn't work. So there's a lot of issues around the complications of medication in the longer term, and and motor fluctuations that arise as a result of that. So looking at this no-on back to our chart of the doses of the day, we've now got the third dose has been missed. So that in that point, you can end up with this situation where, say, third dose is missed, and say an hour, hour and a half later, the patient remembers they've missed the dose of medication. They take that third dose late. You can again get this no-on effect, where now the problem is that the dopamine levels in that person's system have fallen so low from having delayed the dose that when they take the dose, it fails to reach the effective range of the lower line on the chart. So they get this no-on effect. So again, either from combining the medication with a large amount of protein, or from taking a dose too late, there can be medication failure. So it's important that we understand how medication works, because we're looking at enabling people to get the most out of day-to-day life, and they need to work with and around the medication regimes, rather than sort of be kind of undermining themselves perhaps by erratic use and not very good timing of the regime. So another issue around medication use in the long term can be dyskinesia, and probably most of you are familiar with this uncontrolled writhing movements that people with Parkinson's get as an unwanted side effect of their medication. You may have seen this happening, and again, this can arise and then stop very instantly, almost like the switching of a light switch, and it will happen in a cyclical pattern. And it can be very useful from a therapy perspective to enable patients to identify what sort of pattern their dyskinesia follows. Obviously, medication is reviewed regularly and will be trimmed if possible to damp down dyskinesia. But the con side of that is that it would also damp down capacity for movement. So some people will tolerate a certain amount of dyskinesia, particularly as it tends to come in episodes of 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes, and then stop. And then they'll get several hours of good movement with their medication dose. So let's just have a look at the two possible ways that this can occur in a pattern. So some people guess, if we're looking at one dose of medication now, as the medication starts to take effect, they get the response to the medication, their movement becomes more fluid, and easy, the rigidity reduces. But as the level of medication reaches its peak, where we've got the little star on the top of the line, that's when the episode of dyskinesia happens. So at the peak of the dose, and then time passes, that episode passes. That episode may well only last something like, as I said, 10, 15 minutes, and then it'll abruptly stop. Then they'll have more good on time, as we call it, where the movement is relatively easy. And then we know then that pattern is called peak dose dyskinesia. And once someone understands that, they can actually anticipate it. So if they know that from taking a dose of medication, 1.5 hours later, I get this episode of dyskinesia, they can start to anticipate that and make sure that isn't the time that they're trying to make a telephone call to HMRC or queuing in the supermarket to pay for their purchases. Try to sort of make sure that you can plan around dyskinesia. If you understand it, it's an uninvited guest for sure in people's lives, but understanding it and working around it, and maybe allowing time to either dance through it is one of the more creative things I've seen people do. Other people find lying on the floor, perhaps on a yoga mat or a soft rug, can be a way to deal with it and wait for it to pass. Other people sometimes find other rhythmical movement or walking can help to kind of channel the movement somewhat, but certainly not trying to fight against it. And ourselves as well, if someone has an episode of dyskinesia and you're trying to have a conversation and assess them, I would recommend that you actually pause the conversation, let the episode pass, and then pick up the conversation. And if you're on a home visit, that can be a good time to go and measure for rails and door widths or whatever it is that you might need to be doing while you're there, and let the patient just have a bit of time to go through the dyskinesia episode. likewise, if you're seeing someone on an inpatient ward or even in a clinic, to try and just give them a bit of time to let the dyskinesia pass before you're demanding any attention, because it's actually very physically tiring. It's rather like going for a 5-mile run in energy terms. So that would be the pattern of peak dose dyskinesia. And this would be the pattern of what we call biphasic or diphasic, sometimes it's called dyskinesia, where you get these 2 episodes of dyskinesia, but at the moment, as the medication is beginning to take effect, and then again, the episode passes, and then the medication works well for a while, and then as the medication gets to that point where it's starting to wear off and getting to the point where the next dose is due, soon before that, maybe half an hour before the next dose was due, then the dyskinesia kicks in again. So this pattern of dyskinesia, again, like I was saying, if it's understood and anticipated, it can be more easily accommodated than if you just try and sort of carry on regardless, which is an approach that I've seen some people take. So thinking more about that 4th of the cardinal symptoms now, postural instability, this poor balance and the slowed down saving reactions that are associated with Parkinson's. So the saving reactions are either absent or slow, and gravity will tend to win if there's a threat to balance. People with Parkinson's are much poorer at making those instant adjustments to save themselves. If they stumble, they'll tend to fall. And particularly interestingly, people with Parkinson's who have a loss of balance backwards, so by looking up overhead, reaching up into the top of a cupboard, for instance, for blankets off a top shelf or something, a backward fall is particularly injurious and does not appear to trigger any sort of saving response at all. I've seen film of people with Parkinson's being assessed in terms of this symptom of postural instability in the Gait lab, and they wear a harness, rather like an A-frame of a child's swing. You can put someone into a body harness like they would wear with a parachute, and then they stand on a platform a few meters square, and then that platform can be tilted in any angle abruptly. And then the patient does it, there's sort of saving reactions or not, they do the startle response, but because they're in the harness, of course, they don't fall. So I've seen films of this done with people with Parkinson's and people without as kind of ordinary controls. And the saving reactions are really interesting in terms of the backward falls. When people have a threat to their balance in the backward position, so they're standing on this forced platform and they're tilted backwards, a person without Parkinson's will take this automatic short step backwards, so that they're shifting the base of support and the center of gravity is supported. That would be a normal saving reaction. Obviously, with forward stumbles and trips and falls, that kind of startle reflex, the arms going out, that kind of saving reaction is what we would expect to see. And in people with Parkinson's, when they're assessed in this way, what we actually see is a reduced speed and a reduced kind of physical strength going into any kind of forward fall simulation saving reactions. And when it comes to the backward fall simulations, we see absolutely zero reaction. Really quite alarming to watch these experiment films where people are tilted backwards on the platform and their face remains completely blank. They don't look shocked. They don't attempt to move their arms out. They don't attempt to take a step at all. So it's like the saving reactions, the balance mechanism in the brain is totally unresponsive to that threat to balance in the backward direction. And if we translate that into what we see in our Parkinson's patients, it can be those particularly injurious falls that are the backward falls, and can often lead to a lot of sort of blows to the back of the head and the shoulder and things. And now we can understand a bit more. If there are no attempts to save and embrace yourself or save yourself with your hands, you can see why people with Parkinson's turn up with these quite severe injuries and fractures from something so simple as reaching upwards. So some of the other common triggers for falls, and it's different for other people. In the Parkinson's clinic where I was working, we also had a falls clinic, and the Parkinson's fallers were falling for different reasons than the non-Parkinson's fallers. So on the screen now, I want to highlight those particular Parkinson-specific causes of falling, in addition to the ordinary causes of falls. So ordinary causes can things like multiple use of 4 or more different medications, footwear problems, worn footwear, worn flooring, steps and stairs, bad vision, all those kind of ordinary sort of things that will cause people to fall. But in addition, people with Parkinson's often fall just from the simple changing direction, from turning around. We saw it in the video earlier, the great difficulty the lady had at the beginning of the video where her feet are shuffling and turning. And that'll often lead to people having an actual fall, because as I was noting while we were watching that video, often when the feet are not moving very fluidly, the hands are still moving quite fluidly, and a well-meaning assistant can reach out to give you help, so to help you walk, but the feet will stay stuck to the ground, so that will lead to a fall flat on the face. Or people who are stuck with turning may reach for an object like a banister or something to try and pull themselves out of this frozen position. So it's not unusual for people to actually have falls with the turning, or then with the hesitation of the feet, with the start hesitation, either just taking that first step when they've stood up, or when they've had an episode of freezing of gait. So as they're walking along, again, like we saw in the video earlier, and the feet just abruptly stop, become temporarily glued to the spot. Then there's that tendency in people with Parkinson's to have that shuffling gait, which is sort of very close to the floor. So very easy to scuff up rugs and mats and different floor surfaces that are uneven, causing difficulties and tendencies to trip. And then that trip, unlike a person without Parkinson's, will tend to lead to a fall because of that slowness of the saving reactions, if they kick in at all. And then we also see problems around the kind of the slowness of walking. And we need to particularly think of people moving in public space, and difficulties around crossing roads, getting off trains, all those sorts of things. Those can be quite hazardous to balance and posture. And then sometimes we see it, not so much in our clinics, but you're probably aware of this, that sometimes people with Parkinson's have problems with the control of the speed of their walking, so that people find they have a festinating gait, which means that it gathers speed like a runaway train, so that as they're walking, particularly on downward slopes, they find that there's almost breaking into a run, and this can be very difficult for people to actually stop when they get to the end of the road. They need to stop to look, to check the road, and they're finding it very difficult to stop if they've broken into this festinating type of gait. And then the hazard of looking upwards I mentioned earlier. So all of these kind of functional aspects of the rigidity and the postural instability, all those features of Parkinson's are things that people are living with every day. So we need to be accommodating all these things when we're looking at ways to support people to live more safely and independently. So thinking about some general principles, we could go on for hours, but just putting in a nutshell some of the simple principles for enhancing motor function in people with Parkinson's specifically, around enabling people to concentrate and shift back to a more conscious form of movement control, less automatic. Basic movements become so well learned, they become pretty well automatic, semi-automatic. But for people with Parkinson's who have deficient dopamine, that becomes a real problem. So what we need to enable our patients to do is to understand what's going on, and then they can learn to use a different approach and to start to engage their conscious attention at their moments where the medication's dipping, or they're having their micro off and they need to get up out of a chair because they've got to get off the bus, or whatever it is. Teaching people these techniques to shift back to manual control of their movements when their movements are letting them down, so to speak, will be very much about teaching people that they're going to have to pay conscious attention to those movements that used to flow naturally and automatically, but now need to be attended to. And to attend to anything, we need to bear in mind that people have a reduced concentration span with Parkinson's and an increased tendency towards physical fatigue and also mental fatigue. So just advising people, well, if you concentrate when you move and pay attention, you'll be fine, it's not sufficient really. We need to understand the limitations of this as well as the benefits. But you saw in the video earlier that conscious attention, and if you remember the physiotherapist in the third little section of that clip, where she said, and now picture those big steps in your mind. She was asking the patient to concentrate, but just for that short burst when she was moving, and then once she sat down, she can relax again. So when we're asking people to pay attention and concentrate, we do need to understand that there are limits to that, both for ourselves, but also for people in this situation with Parkinson's. So another very useful tip for people who are having trouble with mobility and motor function in Parkinson's is to learn to do one thing at a time, to avoid doing two things simultaneously. So to not walk and talk, to find some sort of solid support if you need to talk while standing up, to start to prepare to take tablets by gathering together the water and the pills and actually sitting down to manipulate the actual tablets and swallow the tablets, take the dose, rather than doing that standing up and wandering around in the kitchen and looking out the window, wondering what the cat's doing next door. So educating people about the benefits of doing one thing at a time will great mileage. And then teaching people to use the kind of cues and triggers that we've also seen examples of and heard about both tonight and in other sessions, where people are using things like visual cues or verbal cues, auditory cues, cue cards and prompt sheets, all those sorts of external prompts and aids to help them both get started in the movement and guide the flow of their movements. And we'll have a look at a couple of those cue cards in a while. And then I mentioned it before, but this dual tasking practice. So there is emerging evidence now. I shouldn't even have a question mark there, because actually the evidence has emerged now that dual task training is possible. So where people need to do two things at once, like walk and carry an object, you know, they can be trained and practiced to do two things together. And it seems that when people do learn to do some simple multitasking, like walking and carrying an object, actually that has a sort of carryover effect into improving other performance of motor tasks. So there's that generalized motor benefit. So certainly it's worth, when there's particular activities that are challenging the individual with their mobility, but it's something that's important to do, then some dual task practice, perhaps using some visual cues, would be a useful way to proceed there. So then thinking about still motor function, often we've thought a lot about mobility, we've thought about the lower limbs, about walking, balance, turning, shuffling of gait, but actually the motor function of Parkinson's and the problems of motor function affect the upper limbs, the hands, the dexterity, coordination as well. So just looking through the page here, there's a lot of demands now around communication now has become like this. It's so much communication is virtual, and people with Parkinson's are readily going online now for dance classes and choirs and mindfulness groups, and all sorts of things now are kicking off. Courses for people recently diagnosed with Parkinson's have switched in the United States. They've switched these things online, and there's been a big uptake during lockdown, I understand, from my colleagues in the Movement Disorder Society. But again, there's issues around dexterity and coordination. So people with Parkinson's may need some support around accessing, you know, contact communication through all the different digital technology. And there are adjustments that can be made to accommodate tremor, which can be one of the big problems. Keyboards can be reset for left and right-handedness and other things like that you will probably be aware of. But it's important to, when we think about motor function, to think more broadly than just the pure mobility. So thinking around dexterity, then there's the eating, the whole domestic side of life. There's personal care, looking after the home. There's leisure, recreation, communication, playing a musical instrument. We've got the drum kits there. We've got the hand-eye coordination. We've got the hand, and it's holding a crystal ball with an eye in it. So generally, that is reduced in people with Parkinson's. But again, to a certain extent, the drug regime will ease some of these dexterity problems. So again, timing events into times a day when the medication is at a good level can be useful, say, for handwriting. If someone wants to do some writing, then do that at a time of day when your drugs have kicked in and they're giving you that kind of smoother movement, capitalizing on that time to be the time that you're active in socializing or using the telephone, communicating, doing your Zoom calls, whatever it is. Because we need to be aware that, you know, the other end of the scale, right down in the bottom corner here, is a hand that's got a spasticity in it, it's got a cramp in it. And that can happen at times when people's medication wears right off. They can find their hands are almost unable to open and use them. And if that were the case, then it may well be that the medication could be reviewed and there could be something done there to make sure that people aren't getting into these fixed dystonic postures in the hands or the feet, where that can also occur. So thinking about those kind of impacts on people's lives, and then some of the things that you know, we could do perhaps to help people. So in terms of you know, personal care and getting dressed, often the dexterity involved in getting dressed is quite challenging, and it's not unusual for people to be spending, you know, half an hour, more than an hour putting on a set of clothes. It's such a normal thing to hear from patients if you actually get into the detail and ask the question. I've heard 27 minutes, there's several times, 27, 28 minutes has been the amount of time that people have taken just fiddling with buttons. So think again about these coping strategies, and this is applying sort of a cognitive technique of organization and then self-cueing and concentrating and talking through the technique. And getting people to actually concentrate on what they're doing. And by actually teaching this technique and perhaps giving something like this as a reminder, as a prompt sheet, those people who were taking, you know, half an hour to get dressed will find that they're doing the task in, you know, a quarter or a third of the time, by simply focusing their attention, using this voluntary control of movement, this one thing at a time, concentrating, describe your actions as you do them. We'll look at how that works for doing up buttons. So the button passing strategy in my book doesn't rely on any gadgets or hooks. It relies on showing this piece of laminated card to someone and getting them to take it away. And just actually getting them to sit down and do what it says on the card and talk through the movements. And it's very rewarding for people who've been struggling a lot with very routine everyday movements to suddenly find they can master that maneuver and fasten buttons again in normal time. Who would have known? You know, and that is one of the benefits of talking to your therapist about these sorts of challenges. So just rounding off now, I've been looking online a lot and just checking out again today, what sort of things are people doing themselves to promote the flow of their movement, to enable them to keep active and enjoy their lives. And we've got a list here of some of the things that were coming up quite frequently in the Parkinson's charity websites. And there's some excellent materials on the Parkinson's UK website about exercise directed at people with Parkinson's, thinking about stages in the early stages, the middle stages, the more advanced stages, giving advice, very specific types of exercise and what will teach people in their different stages, and some examples there. So there's lots of nice short videos and things, and some resources around the exercise hub that I know that Claire Johnson's colleague in physiotherapy, Fiona Lindop, has had a very close hand in sharing our expertise through those sorts of resources. So rounding things off, just thinking about dance. I think in Parkinson's particularly, this partnered dance, there's been quite a lot of research in the last 5 years around dance and Parkinson's. and which style of dance is best. But partner dance in particular had the advantages around postural instability, that once people are in a pair, perhaps with a spouse, it can bring joy back into their week if they have some time dancing together, perhaps in a Parkinson's dance class. And there's a wonderful film about this, and it's called Capturing Grace, and we've got a quote there from Capturing Grace at the bottom. Thank you for your attention. We trust you found this session interesting and that you'll make time to view other recordings in this 6-part series.
To find out more about a Map of Parkinson's app and a Map of Parkinson's course for healthcare professionals, please visit phoenix-aragon education.uk.